Good morning, good people. This is Brother Simeon Gallagher. I have been a Capuchin for 53 years and will soon be a priest for 50 years. And I'm speaking to you today from a rectory in Jackson, Wyoming, where I have been giving a parish mission all week. Lovely, lovely parish by the name of Our Lady of the Mountains. Ordinarily, I would be at home in Denver in St. Francis Friary. I finished my work here in Wyoming this evening and will be flying home tomorrow morning. So we are grateful that you've joined us again in this little few minutes of reflection. And we are about to enter into another one of the great liturgical seasons of the Church's year, namely Advent in preparation for Christmas. In these liturgical seasons, like Advent in preparation for Christmas or Lent in preparation for Easter, I've always tried to pick a piece of literature that frameworks for me the meaning of the season. Last Lent, for example, I hope you will forgive me, but I didn't choose something that was strictly religious, but a book that had enormous religious threads, religious insights, religious thinking, and that was Melville's famous novel, Moby Dick. For this season of Advent, beginning next weekend, I've chosen a very famous sermon written and delivered by John Henry Cardinal Newman in the 19th century. In fact, on the 13th of July in 1852, it commemorated the restoration of the Catholic hierarchy in England, and all the bishops gathered at Oscott College, which is in the Archdiocese of Birmingham, and he gave them this very important sermon. It's called the Sermon of the Second Spring. The Catholic Church in England had been decimated as a result of the policies of Thomas Cromwell and Henry VIII, and the Church went through a terrible period of time of persecution. Many people, priests, bishops, lay people, many people lost their lives in martyrdom in that period during the reign of Henry VIII and then Elizabeth I. And finally, Pope Pius XI decided after several hundred years to restore the hierarchy. They had been under the direction of vicars apostolic, many of whom were in France and in Italy. And so the hierarchy was restored with great protestation by the British government. They would rather that the Catholic Church had just disappeared completely. But that wasn't the case. Pius IX restored the hierarchy, and the bishops gathered at Oscott College outside of Birmingham, and Newman was invited to give this very famous sermon called The Second Spring, in which he related the beginning of Christianity in England with St. Augustine coming with many monks, eventually establishing monasteries, abbeys, and a rich Catholic life. In fact, England was almost 100% Catholic, and all of that came to a grinding and destructive halt in the 15th century as a result of the policies of King Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell, who was sort of like his lieutenant in the destruction of church properties and so forth. Newman gave this famous homily in which he related all of that history and then spoke about God and his grace, giving the church in England and the Catholic faith a new life and a new beginning with hope and with certitude of his grace. And I choose that because actually the meaning of Advent is that every year we can start all over again. It's a kind of statement of life itself, that as winter gives way to spring and spring gives way to summer and summer gives way to fall and autumn, and life begins again over and over. So faith grows, the church develops, and this was a moment of enormous hope, enormous light, and a moment of great vision for the church once again to be established firmly in England. And we're seeing that more and more. One of the most important shrines in all of Europe in honor of the Blessed Mother, Our Lady of Walsingham, was completely destroyed. Its dates were way back in the 11th, 12th, 13th century. It was completely destroyed by the policies of Henry VIII, and now, thanks be to God, it has been reopened and has become once again a center of pilgrimage. There is hope. There is light, even at the end of the tunnel. I think that this is a meaningful sermon for me to share with you, and if you're interested, you can Google the Second Spring homily of Cardinal Newman, because we have come through with COVID and so much civil unrest and so much animosity and hostility as a result of our presidential campaign here in the United States, that I think that we are caught in a kind of moment and a mood of unhappiness and depression, and we're wondering, will this ever end? And thanks be to God, Dr. Fauci and the rest of the medical community at Oxford in England and so forth, they're telling us that a vaccine is on the horizon and will be made available perhaps in complete form by next spring. What an interesting thing for Newman to call his sermon a second spring, because we're involved in a second spring all the way through the season of Advent. We can begin again. There is no such thing as complete and total defeat. It might seem that evil sometimes has the upper hand, but the reality is that love is always triumphant, and the love of God the Father for the world, for all creation, and for each of us is made manifest in the incarnation of Jesus, his Son. The Word became flesh, and he dwells among us and renews us, as is the case in springtime, in our faith, in our relationships, renews our hopes, our prayer life, renews us from the inside out, and gives us a positive, hope-filled vision and view of the world and of ourselves. So I've chosen that to be my reading material, parsing each line. It's a long sermon, and I hope that you will enjoy that also as a bit of Advent reading. Now, before I stop, let me say that one of the graced moments in my life as a Capuchin priest and my ministry as a preacher occurred a number of years ago in the very chapel at Oscott College in the Archdiocese of Birmingham, where Newman gave that sermon. I was conducting a retreat for the clergy of the Archdiocese of Birmingham, and they had a freestanding podium in the middle of the chapel, and I was very much aware that this is where Newman gave this famous homily, and I said to the rector of the seminary, would it be possible for me to use the pulpit that Newman used for his famous sermon on the restoration of the British hierarchy? And the rector said to me, well, you can use it, but you're going to have to clean out all the buckets and all the mops that we put there. I was horrified, but what could I say? That they had turned this wonderful, it's embedded in a pillar, and you have to go into the pulpit by going up inside the pillar. And I said I would really appreciate if one of my homilies, one of my sermons, one of my conferences to the priests could be given just to satisfy my own love of history and my love for Cardinal Newman. Would it be possible for me to give one of my conferences from that same pulpit? And he allowed me to do that. I share all of that with you because there is newness and there is life. Henry VIII did a great deal of destruction, but here we are now with a rebirth going on in the Catholic community, specifically in England through the restoration of the shrine of Our Lady of Walsingham. And Shakespeare would say, and Steinbeck would quote him, The winter of our discontent has turned into the summer, the glorious summer of hope. It's from Shakespeare by way of Steinbeck, and it's to be found, if I'm not mistaken, in Richard III. So, we begin this season of Advent having gone through a terrible year with the loss of human life, with terrible contentiousness on the social scene of our nation, animosity and hostilities centered in so many things, and it would seem as if we're lost, but we're not. God brings us always in this season of Advent a second spring, a third spring, a fourth spring. Hope springs eternal. And I think that's from Emily Dickinson. God bless you. You're in our prayers, and let's always continue to pray for each other. Amen.